Okay, good evening everybody. As the introduction said, my name is Brendan O'Sullivan and I'm working with Airgrid on their programme for the I-SEM, which is, as we say, it's a new wholesale market for Northern Ireland and Ireland. And just to give you the flavour, as Laura said there, I'm going to talk you through some of the mechanics, some of the details of how these things are going to be done. The background I'm going to give you to that is kind of, first of all, just a brief developments in power markets in Ireland and Northern Ireland. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but just to give you the difference between what we do here under the SEM and where Europe has actually gone. And as part of that, I'm going to talk about the developments of power markets across Europe over the last number of years. Out of that, I hope that I will be able to explain to you what market coupling is. This is a term that's been used a lot about the evolving European markets. I know when I first heard it, I scratched my head and people kept showing me, I didn't know what it meant, and hopefully I'll be able to explain it to you here this evening. And from that, we'll move towards the elements of the I-SEM, the pieces that will make up the market, and you'll see then how it connects to the European markets that are there. First thing for main developments in Ireland, Northern Ireland, was the implementation of the SEM in 2007. And the things to focus on here was the design. The market design was based on a gross mandatory pool model with a single system marginal pricing. Now, in the gross pool model, what you'll see there is basically generators selling in and supplier units, which are basically the retail companies buying out. So everybody buys and sells through this one single mechanism, and they all settle at a single price. And these blue boxes at the bottom, the customers, that represents us. We're the ones, these yellow boxes are our retail companies that we buy our electricity in our homes from. So this is Electric Ireland, this is Energia and all those companies. And they will be buying from a pool direct from generators. There would have been a contracts for difference market there, which basically is a financial contracts market that can exist outside of the main wholesale arrangements, pardon me, tripping over my tongue. But the main part of the design is the central pool. And the other key thing about it is it's based on an ex-post pricing and a single-sided participation. Now, what those two things, why I bring them up, is they are uniquely different from what Europe does. Ex-post pricing means we actually price after the event. We actually come along after we've seen what the consumption was and we work out what the cost of that was. What that means, we get this single-sided graph here. What you see here is basically generators, power providers, that's generators, demand side units, people offering imports on interconnectors. They offer in bids and offers into the SEM and they get stacked up onto a supply curve. But the retail companies, because we only evaluate their consumption ex post based on actual metering, they just basically take the volume, and the demand curve, which you would normally see in an economic sale, basically represents a straight line. So the power providers offer in trades to sell, but no retail companies bid to buy. They just literally take what comes out. What happened in Europe is different from that. Basically, the power markets have been evolving in Europe since the early 1990s. Nord Pool was one of the primary ones, which started off in Norway and started expanding into the greater Scandinavian area over the course of the decade, moving to Sweden and into Finland, encompassing Denmark. And you'll see in some of the later graphics, it's gone on to encompass the Baltic states as well. Now, the markets that were set up in Europe were based on stock exchange models. Some of them actually even were set up by the stock exchanges. So they literally followed that kind of way stocks are traded. And that they became known as energy exchanges or power exchanges. And those terms have persisted today, and they're synonymous with basically markets and market operators across Europe. They operate double-sided auctions, but the other key thing is their markets are firm at day ahead. If you remember, as I said, the SEM settled ex post, which means it becomes firm after the fact. These basically come up with contracts before the fact. And it means that both producers offer to sell and suppliers are bidding to buy. And what you get from that is you get the more standard economic graph, where basically you'll see here the consumers, the supply companies will put in prices and they will be descending down, prices from generators ascending up. And that's offers to sell, bids to buy. And when they cross, this is called clearing point. So all quantities on this side are now served. They're basically in merit, they would be called. And this becomes the price of all energy. And this becomes what's referred to as maximizing social welfare, in the sense that what you see here is a generator here who is willing to sell for quite a low price is getting a much better price. So that's maximising the producer surplus. But equally, on the consumer side, consumers who are actually willing to pay quite a high price for their electricity just because they need it, are actually getting a much cheaper price. And when this area is maximised, it's referred to as the economic surplus. But that's the market clears where those values meet. Now, in Central Europe, in the early part of around 2001, 2002, the Amsterdam Power Exchange started off an initiative to look at basically how to improve cross-border flows. What they were looking at was power flows between the Netherlands, between Belgium and France. And they basically found that they were just quite suboptimal. And they showed basically large differences in prices while interconnector capacity was still available. And what that means is you could have had a cheap price, and Laura explained this here in terms of importing between GB and Ireland. You could have had a cheap price in Amsterdam and a high price in Belgium, but the interconnector wasn't flowing. The obvious thing was to ship the cheap electricity from the Netherlands into Belgium, and that wasn't happening. And that would have been observed around 60% of the time. This all came from legacy arrangements where basically those operators ran their own markets and then would just have kind of contracts for cross-border, but they just weren't getting it right. And the cross-border flows also showed high-price areas serving load in low-price areas. So literally going the wrong way. And that was shown about 40% of the time in those trades. So they came up with a solution which they initially referred to as the trilateral coupling. And it was trilateral because it was between those three countries on the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium and France. You've seen this graph, so I won't dwell on it, but you get the point. Flows in the wrong direction. What the coupling intended to do, if we show the two markets individually, market A and market B, and this is, say, the Netherlands market and the Belgian market, and you both get similar demand curves coming in, right, and supply curves coming out. But you see they both clear at markedly different points. So you get very different prices between the two markets. What this initiative did, the coupling initiative, was to actually pool all the orders, these two curves, into one set of order books. And what it meant was that rather than somebody nominating a contract to move energy from one to the other, it let the markets decide. So it basically looked at that and said, we have a price divergence between the isolated markets. Well, the obvious thing is that some of the generation in the cheaper market should serve the load in the more expensive market. And what that means is the demand curve in the cheaper market moves, and that represents an export, while the generation curve in the dearer market shifts over, meaning some generation, some of the more expensive generation in market B gets displaced by the cheaper generation in market A. But what you get is efficient energy flows between the two markets. And the net position, basically, you get price convergence on coupled markets. Now, that's the basic vision of market coupling. Now, it works until such time as interconnectors become congested. When no more power can flow, then prices start to separate. But you can see how this works, and it does deliver a good solution once the interconnection is there. And this is what it looks like. This is actually the same data that we had up earlier, and it's basically measured before and after the coupling solutions were put in place. So where Europe went from there over the next 6 years, that initiative went live in November 2008. You started to see coupling across larger parts of Europe. The Nordic areas were already largely coupled under the Nord Pool spot arrangements, and then, as I say, the Baltic countries joined in there in 2012. And that means all those countries are now trading energy in that same manner through a single order book, effectively. The trilateral arrangements expanded to include Germany and they became known as the pentalateral arrangements. That was a mercifully brief arrangement because it's an awful acronym. Became known then as CWE, Central West Europe. And these became major projects. And around the same time as these were happening, the European Commission was also monitoring and putting in place legislation to actually fix these as law. In Spain, OMI, which disappears here into the logo, OMI, the market operator, started arranging coupling between Spain and Portugal. And all of these things, all these bodies here, you notice there's, in the end, a handful of market operators around the place. GB got involved because it had interconnectors on BritNed, connecting it to the Netherlands, and IFA into France. So they were again able to connect their power markets into this as well. They created an initiative called the price coupling of regions, where rather than using all their own individual market arrangements, they brought them into one. And that was called, as I say, price coupling of regions, or PCR. And it means all of these areas put their orders into one piece of software, one algorithm, and you end up with one single coupled set of markets. So power flows between all these markets measured in the one algorithm and measured to determine efficient flows. Now that looks like a kind of a nice pipe dream. This went live last year. The bulk of these countries started full coupling in February 2014. The Iberian markets, Spain and Portugal, joined in May. The only one left to join is the Italian market, which is yet to join, I believe, either this month or next. We're marked here in orange in this because the initiative of PCR is based on, it's a set of arrangements owned by these market operators. And in Ireland, we are actually associate members, and that gives us a kind of an oversight view so we can see what's going on, and is helping us to prepare for where we're going with the next set of arrangements. But as I say, along the time this was happening, the European Union was also putting in place the legislation. That legislation took the form of what was known as the Third Energy Package. This is a set of regulations and directives published in 2009. Covers issues like access to grids, ownership and bundling, transparency of data, and also sets out the markets and the way these markets are supposed to be managed. And they were originally a set of framework guidelines to be developed by the regulators across Europe to turn into network codes to be developed by the transmission system operator organizations across Europe. And what this ended up with was what gets known as the target model. This is the EU target model. And in the end, it looks quite simple, but it's not really. You have forward energy markets here. And a lot of the stuff in these network codes, they are very, very firmly explicitly written for cross-border arrangements, but they also apply locally as well. So your forward capacity allocation, this is referred to, so it's referring to allocation of cross-border capacities. And it basically allows for physical, which is basically selling interconnector capacity and people using it for nominating, but also financial rights, where people actually use it as actually a financial hedge against later spot prices. Then you move into physical markets, which really start with the day-ahead coupling, which I've gone through with you. As I mentioned, in the day-ahead coupling, that is where the markets basically decide the power flows, and that's referred to as implicit allocation. There's no one person saying explicitly, this is what I want to do with the day-ahead market. The actual markets themselves, on the basis of prices, are saying, this is the optimum movement of energy. And then what was added to that in 2012 was continuous intraday trading. And this is also implicit allocation. This is the market that opens after the day ahead has closed. And basically it allows people adjust their positions all the way up to 1 hour away from real time. And that's one of the key things about this, because that gives these markets the power to adjust for changing wind forecasts, changing load forecasts, and items like that. And then finally, balancing real-time markets. And in these cases, this is basically where the TSO takes over the organization of the power systems and controls, but they also very, very clearly set out the rules for cross-border sharing of balancing resources. So they envisage common merit orders between what's referred to as coordinated balancing areas. So for example, we could have Northern Ireland GB as a single area, which means we could actually avail of power stations in GB to serve problems that we're having here on our power system in real time, as long as we actually have cross-border capacity. Each of these areas have got network codes that have been developed. This is the forward capacity allocation. The physical market one is the catchily titled Capacity Allocation and Congestion Management, which we all like to call CACM for short, and electricity balancing for real time. When we look at the I-SEM and what the I-SEM means, you'll notice a lot of what I've just gone through. It's based on a forwards market, a day-ahead market, intraday markets, and balancing markets with imbalance settlement. Imbalance settlement is kind of the final wash-up that comes afterwards. And just to talk briefly through the elements that we're going to see in the I-SEM when we finally put it in place. We're going to have financial trading within the I-SEM. That means basically power producers and consumers will be able to enter into financial contracts with themselves to basically hedge against any potential price spikes in day-ahead markets or intraday markets. So they can actually use that. So that's going to be one of the key features. Also, financial transmission rights for cross-border flows. Key thing about this is what it means is our interconnectors are actually left free for the day-ahead market. That puts a huge amount of cross-border capacity available in the day-ahead market, and that basically increases our liquidity because we have access to trades that are happening elsewhere in Europe, and that's a great benefit there. There's also the potential for centralized platform for forward financial trading, and that's going to hopefully encourage liquidity into that space. There's probably other additional liquidity measures are going to be addressed. Key thing is there's no physical forward contracting. People are not actually following the GB model and striking deals with themselves and then just saying, here you go, Mr. Consumer, this is the price you take. That's not happening. Basically, they have their financial contracts as a hedge, but the physical power is all based on the day-ahead market. And in that terms, the terms being used is the day-ahead market's the exclusive route to market. There is no other route to market for the day-ahead. So if you're actually coming into the day-ahead, this is your only way. You'll see me use the same term on the intraday. And it is using the European market coupling algorithm. So that's what we're using. We're using that price coupling, and it is going to be used to determine the flows and the way that it's actually determined the proper power flows across other parts of Europe. We're using it in a unit-based participation, which means we're sticking with the SEM model of generation units and demand units actively trading themselves. And that, again, has benefits of transparency for consumers. They can see where prices are coming from, rather than things being done in large portfolios. There is going to be portfolios in here. And by portfolios, we basically mean some people can group units together, but it is for certain levels of participation. Particularly, it's felt it's needed for wind generators, so aggregators will be allowed to come in and offer commercial facilities to wind generators, but also there's this concept called an aggregator of last resort. If you're a small wind player out there who basically sees this day-ahead market as a massive overhead to get involved in, this is their route. They can actually go to this aggregator of last resort and they will manage their trading facilities and they will still get paid. One of the key things here is the day-ahead commercial structures. What they use in Central European markets is different from what we currently use in the I-SEM. And at the moment, we're in the process of trialling those commercial structures. It's an ongoing piece of work we've been doing over the last number of months from SEMO, and we'll be doing it, and we hope to be doing it with the industry across the rest of this year. The intraday market is based on the continuous European solution. Now, this is known as XBID, which is cross-border intraday. Now, as I mentioned, almost at the end of talking about coupling, this came in 2012. This hasn't actually gone live in Europe yet. Cross-border intraday will go live in Europe around 2015. Oh, sorry, in 2015. It's due later this year. We expect to plug into that and use that as our solution. But it's a project that's still under development, and we're keeping a watching brief. And just as we have the associate membership for the PCO, we have the associate membership on this project as well. So we have an active view on what's actually going on. There is scope for regional auctions. So basically, if GB and ourselves decide we want to have regional auctions similar to the auctions that we have in the SEM today, we can do that if we want. As I mentioned, it is the exclusive route. There is no scope for generators or suppliers to go out and strike bilateral contracts with themselves with no price discovery. Everybody will see the prices that are coming from this. And the same granularity is day ahead, so it is the unit-based participation with portfolios as permitted. The key thing about the intraday market is it's envisaged as the adjustment market. So the idea being that what players will get in the day-ahead market, which is a trading platform, it's there for clearing trades. And if those trades don't match up to low profiles that they actually start using, the intraday is the market where they go in, they buy additional power, or they sell additional power if they've overbought. It's basically the market that's there for participants to actually balance themselves before the balancing market kicks in. Then the balancing market will kick in, and at this point, one of the key things is the day-ahead positions are considered to be the starting point. Now, its physical notifications will be coming to the system operator. This is different from how the system operator does things today, where we operate on a centralized scheduling approach. But here, we were basically participants taking the outputs of what they get from Europe, their match trades, and giving us notifications. And they should be technically feasible, because the amount of time we have, that's an interesting thing. Our time window changes a lot in this. Currently in the SEM, we have something around 24 hours between gate closure of the market and when the market actually starts. So basically, the market that closed this morning opens tomorrow at 6 a.m. The day-ahead market here closes at 11 a.m. and the market starts trading at 11 p.m. So it's a time window of 12 hours. Not a long time. So it's important that the nominations, the data that comes to the system operator, is fully technically feasible and will represent what a generator can do. And then we're going to have commercial offers from participants. And these are following the European standard of balancing markets, which are incremental and decremental prices. So it's a price to increase their output or price to decrease their output. The EU approach is that balancing actions happen in the last hour, so basically they allow the markets to settle and the system operator just takes over at that last time. That works because a lot of EU markets are on the basis of external bilateral contracts, and a lot of stuff is sorted before the day ahead. Because we are putting our liquidity into the day ahead, it doesn't work for us. And that's why in the I-SEM, TSOs will be able to take earlier balancing actions. Now, the intent is over time that this will not be necessary, that the system and participation will mature to the point where where people will balance and they will recognize their balance responsibility. But it's allowed there as it stands. And that means actions have to be classed. What the system operator does today basically is a dispatch instruction to a generator to produce X amount of megawatts. That has to be classed as either an energy or a non-energy action. And that's largely around the amount of technical constraints on the island, that sometimes we will get results back from this day-ahead market that actually can't actually be met. And that's down to technical feasible constraints on the island. Those things have to be classed as non-energy. The reason for that is so they don't feed into the final pricing. It's recognized as a constraint cost, not an actual energy cost. So we finalize with marginal and balanced pricing based on the actions the system operator takes. The current vision is for non-energy actions are paid at cost, which is the bids that were put in, whereas you'll have, and to be excluded from the price calculation. But other actions will go into what the price calculation is and set the price of balancing energy. Balanced responsibility is envisaged, and that basically means people get a position at day ahead, they can refine that position at intraday, but in the end they're held responsible for that position. So if a generator gets a position to produce 100 megawatts and they produce 102, they will be charged, or they will be paid at an imbalanced price for that 102, not their contract price. I mean, balanced responsibility doesn't necessarily mean we're going around for everybody saying, no, you absolutely have to do 100 megawatts or we're throwing you off the bars. It is basically balanced responsibility is enforced in the imbalance pricing and imbalance calculation mechanisms that will be there. And the final imbalance, as I mentioned there, it's going to be based on metering. And that's a similar concept of what we use. We'll be looking at the aggregate contracted positions over all markets, and that includes the balancing market. Those will represent contracts with the system operator. And we will be doing imbalance determination based on that. Another part of the I-SEM, Laura mentioned it, is the capacity remuneration mechanism. We're going to briefly talk through what this is. And the principle of it is that generators need to recover their costs, and part of what helps them recover their costs are price spikes. So most energy markets should allow for the basically scarcity to be priced, which basically means when energy is really scarce, the price should just go where the price needs to go and set it according to the value. In most cases, we don't do that. We set price caps. Price caps in Europe exist, and they're set at €3,000 per megawatt hour on the day-ahead market and the intraday market. What this means is the generator who could have been relying on the price going to €10,000 is actually missing money. That's what it's referred to as a lot, the missing money problem. So this is why we're looking at a capacity remuneration mechanism to basically cover this missing money problem. The first thing is we're going to have a level of capacity requirement that's going to be set through an auction, and generators are going to compete for that, bid in basically what it's worth to them. And they will sell what's called a reliability option. And what happens is they get paid for that reliability option, and the supplier will pay it. So the supplier will actually pay irregular capacity payments. The generator will receive a regular capacity payment through his reliability option, What this means is nobody is actually relying on that massive price spike anymore. The generators don't need spike prices. And what it means is when prices spike, the generators actually pay back. And that's why it's referred to as an option. It's effectively like a financial call option, and it basically means when the volatile prices, this uses reference prices and strike prices, which I know I'm jumping around, so apologies if you're not following. The next diagram may make it more clear. But it basically means the generator will actually pay spiky prices to suppliers. It gives expensive flexible units the ability to compete, because if they're expensive, they can actually build in their revenue from system services payments into their bids into the market, into the capacity market. And it also gives a signal for demand side and interconnector flows. Just to show you what it would look like, if your bottom line there, your red line across the bottom, that's your basic revenue that a generator will be getting for this. And that will be all the way through. So we'll be getting that all the time. And it's a nice steady stream. And a supplier will be paying something like that as well. The green line represents what the reference market is doing. So basically, if this is, for example, connected to the day-ahead price shoots up to, say, 1,400 we put there. That's a very, very high bill for supply companies to be covering. So we have a strike price in there. In this example, we set it at 500. What this means is, in exchange for making those payments to generators ensure that suppliers never have to pay prices above the purple line. So we have that revenue, that covers the missing money. And what it means is the suppliers are funding the regular capacity payments to protect against these spikes. And when the spikes happen, the generator pays that excess revenue back to the suppliers. So it's like a single-sided contract for difference. That's briefly the CRM. There's a lot of more work to be done on that, a lot more detail to be gone into it, so don't worry, it's high level. Where we're finishing, I thought we finished on 2014 to 2017. This is what we're doing now, the I-SEM. We have project teams set up by the SEM RAs, and they're developing detailed design elements of the I-SEM. There's a project team set up working on the energy trading arrangements. There's one starting to ramp up on the capacity remuneration arrangements. I've just come today from an all-day workshop out in the CEO offices in Tala, where we had a very, very lively debate around balancing market arrangements, very constructive stuff going forward, and I'll be back out there tomorrow, hopefully, for more of the same. We have our own team set up with an airgrid. We're getting ready for our implementation projects and what we have to do to get ready, both a system operator, market operator, and other roles that we may be assigned in this work. Workshops and consultations, these are happening already. There's a consultation went out for aggregator of last resort framework, and that's, as I mentioned to you, that's the public body that can take responsibility for small wind generators' participation in the market. There's a series of workshops completed on what we refer to as the building blocks. This is looking at things like how losses are featured in the market, how generators that have a kind of are connected behind a shallow connection, how do they participate? Those kind of details, and a series of workshops were held on them last year. It was very successful, and there's a consultation due any day now, I believe. And the market design workshops, as I say, are underway. There's an agreed working approach document was published on the Regulator's website, and that sets out the detail of the way forward for the I-SEM. It sets out the milestones, what you're going to see, what consultations will be going out when, what workshops will be happening when. There's a lot of detail in it, and it shows basically the path to 2017. And overall, where we are today, I mean, we are at this stage on target for delivery end of 2017. And that's basically it.